Witlog, thank you ever so much for joining me to talk Afghanistan today. I'm grateful for the time that you've made available.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've been an investigative journalist for the Washington Post for many, many years. But I wanted to, specifically on Afghanistan, when did Afghanistan appear in your radar? For most Americans, it was 9/11, but how was it for you? And
Well, the same as a journalist, although I still vividly remember when I was a student I was 11, 12 years old. I was in what in the US they called the seventh grade, and the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And this was big news in the United States. This is during the middle of the Cold War. President Jimmy Carter was going to boycott the Olympics in Moscow. So suddenly there was this country very far away from the United States that was in the headlines. And even as a young student, I remember getting an assignment from a teacher to go do a book report on Afghanistan, on the country, right? And so I grew up in a provincial, I wouldn't even call it a town, it was just a rural area in the eastern United States. And I went to the school library. This is, of course, pre-internet days. And just the assignment turned into find me everything in the library, all source material that mentions Afghanistan. And of course, there wasn't very much. There was some National Geographic magazines and some encyclopedia references, but there was very, very little in terms of knowledge of Afghanistan's history, culture, economy, but this was something people wanted to know. What is this country that the Soviets have invaded and what happened? And, so I still vividly remember that assignment at a young age. And then, of course, Afghanistan did become front and center for the United States, for Americans after 9/11. And back then I was a local news reporter for the Washington Post. I was in my early 30s, and I was, like a lot of reporters, we were sending people all over the world, places that we hadn't ordinarily covered. Now, the Post did have a bureau that had covered South Asia. So we had reporters for a long time who had covered, ever since the 70s, the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet occupation, the Taliban. So we had some reporters who had been accustomed to going in and out of Afghanistan and Kabul, but I was sent to help. And at first I thought I was going to go to Kabul, and I was detoured in December of 2001 to go to Islamabad instead, because at that point, there was real fear that the Pakistanis and Indians would go to war over Kashmir. And so I ended up spending more time back then in Kashmir trying, in case there was going to be nuclear war. That was the fear in late 2001. But it was another period in which, there was this spark on 9/11, but set off this tumultuous cascade of effects throughout the world that were very unpredictable. So the world of journalism really changed. We had to cover things unexpectedly in many parts of the world. We're trying to figure out what happened with 9/11, what led up to it, how would the Bush administration respond. And so over time, I became involved in our international news desk. And I was then assigned to live in Berlin, but my main assignment was covering Al-Qaeda networks throughout the world. And Berlin was home base, so I would travel quite a bit. I covered Al-Qaeda networks in Europe, in North Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. So I would travel into Afghanistan, travel to Pakistan, and write in-depth investigative articles. Starting in 2010, came back to the United States and became a Pentagon beat reporter covering US military. So as part of that job, I would go back quite often to Afghanistan, accompanying the US Defense Secretary or different commanding generals. I wasn't living in Afghanistan, I wasn't based there, but I would go in and out. So similar to how I'd been when I was a foreign correspondent. So I don't want to make this more than it is. I'm certainly no expert in Afghanistan. I was never based there, but over 20 years, like a lot of American journalists, this was always part of the news, and watching the arc of the U.S. involvement militarily in Afghanistan over 20 years was, a big part of my life and career.
Now, you mentioned, you were covering Al Qaeda. There was this story as well that I want to share with you. When I left our village, as we were discussing earlier, when I left my village, fled my village, I spent 6 months in Helmand, and in December 1999, I was to leave Helmand and go to Pakistan, and I spent a day in Kandahar. Now, leaving Kandahar to Spin Boldak, the border town of Spin Boldak. So we were all crammed in this, the Toyota Corolla. I think about 6, 7, all crammed inside. On that highway to your right is the Kandahar Air Base. And then behind the Kandahar Air Base, as there was this place called the Tarnak Farm, which was the base for Al Qaeda.
Right.
And as we were approaching, the vicinity of the Kandahar Air Base, there was a convoy heading our way, and suddenly this driver just swerved violently to the right, and we stopped there, waiting for the convoy to pass. So there were a convoy of Toyota Hiluxes, which were very common for the Taliban to use, and once the convoy passed amid the dust that it was creating, this Pashtun man in front of us on the front seat, he turned around and said in Pashto, Osama, means it was Osama bin Laden. So I probably came face to face. I don't know how true that was, but it's very likely that it was true.
Right.
That I came face to face with bin Laden.
Right.
But I didn't know anything about who bin Laden was then. So I was just 12. Now, how did you experience 9/11? I mean, how did it make you feel as an American with that might to be attacked in a way that it was?
Well, I think obviously it was a real shock that the United States had, at that point, the Cold War with Russia and the Soviet Union had been over for 10 years, and there really hadn't been this prominent national security threat to the United States for the preceding decade. So to have this terrorist attack that was really, involving multiple passenger airlines striking the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and this plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, but was clearly intended for the White House or the U.S. Capitol. This just took the oxygen out of life in the United States. I mean, people sort of forget that air travel shut down for a couple of weeks. Who can think of something like that, right? That the skies are closed for day after day after day because nobody knew what was coming next. Where might the next threat come from? And so this just came as a real shock. I was, vividly remember I was on my way to the Washington Post in downtown Washington, D.C., taking the subway system and, at around 9 o'clock in the morning. And you start to see, this is before people got news on their cell phones. They had cell phones, of course, but they didn't have smartphones.
There were no push notifications then.
That's right, exactly. But there was this, normally at that time of the morning, of course, the commuters are all going into Washington, but that day was very different. You see this stream of people coming back out of the subway system, leaving downtown DC, going back out into the suburbs with these horrified looks on their face. And I had heard at that point a radio broadcast that there had been a crash at the World Trade Center, but clearly by the time I had gotten on the subway, another plane had struck the Pentagon, which is, the Pentagon is in Virginia, but it's right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. So you could just see the fear on people's faces. And but as a journalist, you have to go where the news is, right? So I'm one of the few people going into town on the subway. Everybody else is jam-packed trying to get out. And, in our newsroom was very chaotic. They're just trying to make sense of it and send people. The Washington Post newsroom is just a couple of blocks from the White House. So we had editors saying, go to the White House. It's almost like in case there's a plane crash or just to watch, nobody knew what was happening and, or what was behind it. It took some time. So it was just it was a day like any other in terms of just, this crash after crash after crash, and then there's a pause, but nobody knows what's going to happen next. There's that fear of the unknown, where there are more strikes coming, where there are going to be more attacks. And, that's something that I think, hadn't been experienced in the United States since the Japanese attacked the Navy base at Pearl Harbor in 1941. But this is happening in the biggest city in the United States, in New York City, and in Washington, our seats of financial and political and military power all at once. And, pretty soon there was discussion that this was carried out by Al Qaeda, and speculation was before they took credit for it in those hours as unfolding. But even then, it was very difficult to think, well, how could this, obscure terrorist group pull off something like that? And how did it, immediately as journalists are trying to figure out, how did this happen? How did these hijackers get on these planes? Obviously back then, aviation security was much different, and so it was much easier. They found a real vulnerability, but it just, the country was, was floored for days and weeks, trying to sort of figure out which way is up and how to respond and how to react. So it was a very sobering time, I guess is the best way to put it, and a very frightening time, because people didn't know where the next attack might come. This had, attacked our air system, and it just felt like nowhere in the country was safe.
Going to America's reaction to what happened, your book is the Afghanistan Papers, is a kind of a comprehensive expose of what happened next and how America reacted to the attacks. The anger was so overwhelming that the American leaders took their sight off the bigger picture, I suppose, as you cover in the book, that they wanted to do something, and do something quick, in order to calm the nerves in America's public.
I think so. I think it's less black and white than that, maybe. I think there certainly was anger. I think it was fear of the next attack, and how do we defend ourselves? I don't think it was, I mean, certainly there were some people saying revenge, and we need to go after this, but I think it really was a feeling of self-defense, that, the core of the country had been attacked, our nation's capital, the financial center in New York. And, this is a country that has only, in everybody's lifetime, for the most part, our territory had not been attacked except for Pearl Harbor in 1941. So this is something that, you felt safe in our country from external attack. We weren't worried about the Canadians or the Mexicans invading, right? And
Yeah.
so to have something like this happen was just so out of anyone's experience or mindset, that there was real fear. And I think there was a sense of self-defense. But the question was, what are we defending against? And how do you prevent another attack from happening? So there was this fear of, where is it coming from and what do we do? It's almost like, this blind attack. You don't know who's doing it or how. It wasn't like the Soviets were doing it and you'd have a conventional military conflict. It was really coming out of the dark, as it were. And of course, it took a while to piece together, but even though Al Qaeda was behind these attacks, and bin Laden at that point had been in Afghanistan, the plot, of course, was mostly planned and carried out in Europe and in the United States. So, you had the hijackers who were based in Hamburg, Germany,
Yeah.
and then they came to the United States, and some of them went to flight school in the United States. So it was really a threat from within in some ways. And so there was a lot of concern about, are there other sleeper cells in the United States? I don't think there was a fear back then that, that there was going to be military strikes from Afghanistan in the United States. It was more, where are the other sleeper cells? Are they in the United States? Are they in Europe? Or where is bin Laden? So certainly there was a lot of anger at bin Laden and wanting to find him and kill him. But of course, that was easier said than done. And it wasn't that the United States lashed out militarily right away. It took a few weeks. right? And which is not something you would expect necessarily looking back. It wasn't like the next day or the next week. And even then, the the military campaign in Afghanistan with the US and NATO at first was meant to be a very light footprint. There weren't many troops on the ground. This was an aerial campaign where the Americans and the British and others were trying to work with the Northern Alliance. And there was a real sense of we don't want to get bogged down in Afghanistan like the Soviets did. And that was
Yeah.
one of the great ironies, is that even at the very beginning, there was this fear of getting bogged down in Afghanistan militarily. But as I write in my book, the problem was there was no real clear objective even then. Even in the early months, I was surprised doing my research that the initial objective of the Bush administration wasn't even to topple the Taliban from power. It was to go after bin Laden, to try and uh, eradicate Al Qaeda. But even in the initial weeks, it wasn't the objective. There was no clear consensus that they had to get rid of the Taliban in terms of removing them from power. Now, it did turn into that later in 2001. And
Yeah.
certainly by December 2001, the Taliban had fled Kabul and had been removed from power. But
And
in
behind the
initial,
scenes, America went to great lengths to convince the Taliban to hand over bin Laden, that they
they
could
did.
stay in
That
power
was
or be part of the settlement that came after.
Bush, President Bush had very publicly, George W. Bush had said, hand over bin Laden and we won't take military action, right? And of course, the Taliban, didn't do that. But it wasn't like there was this. The next day, we were ready to send the 82nd Airborne into Afghanistan. There was some restraint there, but as time went on, that's when things started to evolve and change, and the US objectives and strategy were never really solidified after that. It went from being a war on Al Qaeda in the
Mm.
initial days and months and weeks to something else. So, as I write in my book, really by March of 2002, 6 months after the US first sent troops to Afghanistan, really Al Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan had been eliminated for the most part. Bin Laden, there was a chance to get him at Tora Bora.
Mm.
He escaped into Pakistan, and but except for a very small remnants of Al Qaeda figures in Afghanistan, the network had either been killed, captured, or disappeared. They had dispersed to Pakistan, to Iran, and other places. So here's the United States fighting a war in Afghanistan, but the original objective, the original enemy, which was Al Qaeda, was no longer there. And so
Mm.
that's when things started to slowly go haywire, because the United States, on one hand, there was this euphoria at having toppled the Taliban, but wasn't the objective wasn't quite accomplished because bin Laden was still at large, and there was really still this uncertainty of where are the threats coming from and how do we respond and how do we prevent another 9/11.
But the protagonists of the attack on Afghanistan, of course, America was not alone. You had NATO partners and coalition forces there. But the protagonists in the White House and the American government were these big characters. You had Dick Cheney, you had Paul Wolfowitz, you had Donald Rumsfeld. I'm quite fascinated by Donald Rumsfeld because, as you say in your book, there are points in the book and the documents that you unearthed. He asked the right questions, and in many places.
He did, and sometimes to his own detriment. But you're right, and this is the irony. I think looking back over 20 years, we tend to uh, view things through the same lens. And really, there were a lot of changes over 20 years in how the United States approached things in Afghanistan. Now, obviously, it made many, many mistakes, but it wasn't that the US government clung to one strategy or plan throughout. They were kind of all over the map. But in the initial months, there was certainly Rumsfeld was one of the initial figures who said, we don't want to send hundreds of thousands of troops to Afghanistan like the Soviets did, because the same thing will happen. So we're going to limit the number of military personnel we send there. We're going to try and work with the Northern Alliance, with Afghan allies and other coalition countries, but we don't want to make that mistake of being seen as invaders in Afghanistan and alienating the population, right? So, which in retrospect was correct,
Mm,
but yet, despite that recognition and despite those lessons of history, the United States slowly, gradually kept making those very same mistakes and kept sending more people gradually over time. But initially, Rumsfeld was very hands off. It was the sense of we don't want to get stuck there. We don't want to make that mistake. We don't want to quagmire. And there was a real fear that that would happen. The problem was there was no real plan after the Taliban was toppled, because then you have Afghanistan. Of course, as you well know, is probably the poorest country on earth at that point, the most
mm.
devastated country after years and years of war, civil war, the Soviets, then the Americans coming in. So, I think the Bush administration realized that they couldn't just leave. You would leave this total security vacuum, and the people of Afghanistan needed help. They needed help to get on their feet. You can't just leave at that point. But the United States really didn't have a plan and objective for what to do. They didn't want to take full responsibility for the country. They weren't sure who to hand power to. And so they struggled with a lot of these questions. And you mentioned these documents in Rumsfeld. One of the most fascinating documents I found was a memo he had written in April of 2002. So this is, again, 6 months after the
His
war started.
snowflakes.
Yeah, he would write these memos called snowflakes, because Rumsfeld was sort of an old-fashioned corporate manager, and he would dictate memos, these one-page memos, and they called them snowflakes in the Pentagon because he dictated so many of them that they would rain down, they would fall down on people's desks, and people would have to respond to them. But in April 2002, President Bush had given a speech at a military institute in the state of Virginia, where he was, congratulating himself. At that point, the feeling was the war in Afghanistan was going very well, that the United States had defended itself from 9/11. And, he was, there was this moment of pride and he was bragging, right? But he was
Mm.
also saying, in a televised speech, he says, we will not make the same mistake the Soviets did in Afghanistan. We are not going to get stuck there. And on that same day, Rumsfeld dictates a memo, a confidential memo, to his top generals and policy leaders at the Pentagon. And he says, I'm worried we don't have a plan for Afghanistan. We are going to get stuck there. What's our plan for getting out? And he ends this memo, that's a one-page memo, with one word. It says, help, exclamation point. So the contrast here is really stark. You have the President of the United States in public on TV saying, don't worry, we're not going to make the same mistakes the Soviets did. We're not going to get stuck. But then you have his defense secretary in charge of the Pentagon that same day writing a confidential memo to his generals saying, what are we doing? We don't have a plan, help. And that to me really encapsulates what happened for the next 20 years.
Now,
Is
the thesis of the book is that successive American administrations lied and deceived the public. How did that lie begin and why?
Well, I think that is pretty close to the beginning of it. Again, you have in public the President of the United States reassuring the American people and our allies that they knew what they were doing, that the war was going well. They had a plan, right, to stabilize Afghanistan, make sure Al-Qaeda couldn't return, make sure the Taliban couldn't return. So in public, they're very confident, saying things are going well. In private, in secret, as that memo from Rumsfeld shows, they don't have a plan. Things aren't going well. He's panicking just 6 months into the war. And that to me encapsulates again what happened for the next 20 years is in public. They kept saying, the war is going well, we're making progress, we're turning the corner, things are going well. Even if there were setbacks here and there, the talking points were always, we're making progress, we're making progress. But what we found in these documents, which were confidential interviews, which were memos, classified material, you name it, what you see time and time again in private is the people running the war didn't have a plan. Some of them are pretty stark, these admissions from generals saying, we didn't know what we were doing, right?
Mm.
We didn't have a strategy. There was a British general, David Richards, who
Yeah.
was NATO commander at one point. He's in 2006, he says, we didn't have a strategy. We didn't have a proper strategy. We had a lot of tactics to
Mm.
fight, but we didn't have a strategy. Now, what kind of war commander doesn't have a strategy? He didn't say we had a bad strategy or an ill-advised strategy. He just said we didn't have one. And when I read this interview with him, this confidential interview, I thought, well, he must be exaggerating for effect, right? You know, what kind of general doesn't have a strategy? But there was another one with his predecessor, a confidential interview with a US Army general named Dan McNeill, who was a two-time coalition commander in Afghanistan. And he said the same thing. He says, you know, we didn't have a strategy. I came back from NATO headquarters and they said, try and do this, try and do good, try and do this. But there was no strategy. There was no objective for an outcome. It was just hold the line. And that to me was it's just so striking to see it in black and white, this admission that there was no real plan, that they were just kind of reacting to events. So again, when you read that, these confidential interviews and memos, this admission of there's no plan, we didn't know what we were doing, compared to the constant drumbeat in public of we're making progress, we're winning, it's all going well. It's so disconcerting, it makes
Mm.
your head hurt.
Now, how was, what was driving the lies and the deceits? And why was it passed on to the following administration? So Bush leaves the scene, and with all the Iraq debacle and all that's happened, which pushed Afghanistan into a backwater American mission. But why did the Obama continue to continued the same strategy, I suppose, the strategy of not telling the truth?
Yeah, the same narrative, really. It's a really
Yeah.
good question. And the reason for that, the best I can explain, is there's a real distinction in the American mindset between the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. The war in
Mm.
Iraq was a debacle from the get-go, but that was really based on a lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and so much about that war was flawed from the beginning. But that became apparent from the beginning that there were falsehoods being told about what was going on in Iraq, and that the whole reason for going to war was based on faulty information or flat out lies. The distinction in Afghanistan, of course, is that this war in to the American people is seen as a war of self-defense. This was seen as the justified war. This was seen as the noble cause, right? That this was to protect the country from external attack. So there was real support for the war in Afghanistan, for military action from 2001 on, but particularly in the early years, that the US Congress voted almost unanimously to support military action in Afghanistan. This is in contrast to Iraq. The American people opinion survey showed that 90% of the public supported taking military action in Afghanistan in 2001. Again, this is a war of self-defense, and it was a justified, noble military campaign as far as that goes. So think about it from a political standpoint. If you're the commander-in-chief of our armed forces, which is our president, if you're in the White House, you've been elected to lead the country, what president wants to admit that they're losing the war that the whole country had stood behind as a war of self-defense? Nobody wants to admit they're losing that.
Mm.
That is politically too much to stomach. So it became easier to just mislead people that things are going well and to kick the can down to the next president or the next commanding general. No, and that is the pattern we're able to document at the Washington Post for the Afghanistan papers is, yes, Obama could have come in and said, look, this was all based on a lie, we're getting out. That could have been a choice. But when Obama had run for the presidency in 2008, he campaigned against the war in Iraq. He said that was the flawed war. I'm going to get us out of Iraq.
And Afghanistan was the war of necessity.
The war of necessity and the war of righteousness, so to speak. So his campaign promise in Afghanistan was to fix it, to make sure things are going better. It wasn't to withdraw. Iraq was to get out. Afghanistan was, we need to get this right, because that's a war of self-defense. We need, Al-Qaeda is our enemy. We need to make sure that can't happen again. And the same thing happened with Trump, right? You know, he,
Mm.
on one hand, he wants to get out. On the other hand, he doesn't want to be the president who's pulling out of Afghanistan and loses the war, right? And, you know, and then it falls to Biden, and he pays a price for that. But really, that's why you have president after president. Nobody wants to be in charge and admit that the war, they've lost a war that was seen as a war of
And it
self.
feels as if, you know, this deep divide. You know, you had the politicians, the civilian leadership on the one side, and then you had the military on the other side. It's as if the two sides were not really understanding each other. They were not quite on the same page. And of course, the Obama, you know, during the Obama presidency, you of course had the surge, but Biden was very skeptical about the entire thing, wasn't he?
He was, although his viewpoints change over time too. So I think it's a little too simple to say he was always skeptical. During the early 2000s, he would visit Afghanistan quite a bit. He was the chairman of our Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was a very influential US senator on foreign policy issues, and he was very much in favor of the military campaign in Afghanistan during the Bush years. Then when he was vice president under Obama, in 2009, 2010, he's more skeptical at that point because the war has been going on for nearly a decade, and he's more skeptical about what can be accomplished in Afghanistan. And so he was urging Obama to think twice about the surge, sending extra troops and extra money and aid workers to Afghanistan. And, you know, in that point, that's when you really do see a lot of internal division within the US military, within the Obama administration, the White House over what to do. But again, Obama had promised when he was running for office to fix things in Afghanistan.
Mm.
And the narrative back then was Bush had taken his eye off the ball, so to speak, when he invaded Iraq. And that's true. They stopped paying attention to Afghanistan, and slowly but gradually the Taliban started to come back. And that was a colossal mistake. And so Obama's campaign was, we need to focus on Afghanistan again. But that's when, again,
But it's quite extraordinary and it's staggering that general after general who went to Afghanistan to command American forces in their tens of thousands until, you know, months before the whole thing fell apart, kept repeating the same narrative. We are turning a corner. We're winning this war. And of course, you know, the last General Nicholson, one of the last ones, you know, when Trump sent all the extra soldiers, he believed as well. He was giving that rosy picture. We are about to turn the corner because we've got a president in the White House who really wants to win. But why was it sticking?
well, I'm going to tell you a story about that I think puts that in a different light. So there was one general, there was one commanding general of US and NATO forces. His name was David McKiernan.
Yes.
This was in 2008, 2009. So he was the commanding general of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan at the very tail end of the Bush years, and also at the start of Obama's term in office. And that's when things are not going well. The Taliban's gradually getting stronger. It's launching more suicide attacks outside of southern Afghanistan. So outside of Kandahar and eastern Afghanistan, they start launching attacks in Kabul, at Bagram Air Base, at other parts of the country that had been relatively peaceful up to that point. Taliban's gradually getting stronger. And McKiernan was the first general who wasn't upbeat. And
Mm.
so in his press statements, television appearances, he started, I mean, he wasn't, I don't want to say he was Pollyannish. He wasn't saying we're losing, but he wasn't saying that the United States was winning either. He was saying things aren't going well, that things are going in the wrong direction. And so he gets fired, right, out of the blue by Obama's defense secretary, Robert Gates, who is a holdover
Yeah.
from the Bush administration. And Gates has a press conference at the Pentagon and announces he's relieving General McKiernan of command. And just to give you a sense of how rare this is in the American military to have a war commander relieved of command, the last time it had happened was during the Korean War, when General Douglas MacArthur was relieved of command by President Harry Truman, which was seen as a real MacArthur hadn't been listening to the commander-in-chief, to the presidency. He was, seen as bucking orders. So the president had to get rid of him. That's how rare it was. It had only happened in the last 50 years since the Korean War. So, but the difference in Afghanistan with McKiernan was that Secretary Gates couldn't really couldn't articulate a reason for why he was being fired. The journalists at the Pentagon were like, well, why are you relieving him? And he just said, well, I think it's time for a change, some fresh thinking. But he had only good things to say in public about McKiernan. So it was this complete disconnect between why would you take such an extreme step to get rid of your commanding general without giving a reason? Well, in documents we obtained for the Afghanistan papers in the book, there were these interviews done with people on McKiernan's staff where he said that Gates had come to visit him in Kabul and had said, look, your downbeat pronouncements in public saying that we're not winning the war, that isn't going over well. You can't say that. So in effect, they fired McKiernan because he wasn't optimistic enough, because he was telling the truth, right?
Yeah.
They fired him for telling the truth that the war wasn't going well. So after that happens, what's the message that goes out to every other general in US uniform? It's don't deviate from the talking points. You need to stick to the script that we're winning the war. And so every general after that, and there was usually a new commanding general every 12 or 18 months, they all said, we're making progress, we're going to win, we're going to win, we're going to win, because they knew they would lose their job if they didn't. That was the fear. And so
but have you counted how many strategic reviews they had? Because, president after president, commander after commander, as soon as they take the post, there's a strategic review, rebuking everything the predecessor has done. Let's start afresh. And it tells you something about the incoherence of, the whole operation. But there was another side to the whole conflict and the whole war, was the Afghanistan side, the people whom the Americans had to deal with and the West had to deal with, and how much of this whole dysfunctionality and failure was to do with the people America had to deal with in Kabul.
Well, that's a big open-ended question, but there's certainly many, many factors that go into that. I think to take one stab at answering your question, I think where things really started to go off the rails, so to speak, was around 2009 when there was a presidential election in Afghanistan, when Hamid Karzai is running for re-election. Now, the first time he had run for election, it was this landmark event. There was a free and relatively fair national election, and Karzai was legitimately elected, and he was seen as this real close ally of the United States and other NATO countries in Afghanistan. He was a legitimate national leader. He'd been elected. By the time 2009 comes around, it's a completely different situation. You have some US officials are undermining Karzai. Karzai feels like he's lost the confidence and backing of Washington. The election is illegitimate. There's massive ballot stuffing going on. So on one hand, you have the United States and its allies, the coalition, trying to emphasize the importance of democratic rule in Afghanistan as a contrast to what had happened under the Taliban and other governments. And yet this democracy that had initially taken root was becoming very, very corrupt. I mean, the 2009 presidential elections were terrible. Now, Karzai may have won anyway, but there was no doubt the amount of ballot box stuffing going on was insane. And so you have the Americans on one hand, what do we do? Our closest ally is now taking a turn toward the worse in terms of corruption. His rule is becoming illegitimate. But what do? We can't abandon him, or how do we respond? So again, on the surface, there's this pretense that things are going well, right? That Obama's surge is working, and yet behind the scenes, the tension between the US government and the Afghan government is getting worse and worse. So you're supposed to have this alliance between Karzai's government, the Americans, and NATO against the Taliban, but that alliance is being sorely tested. And for, and there's so much blame to go around. You can blame Karzai, you can blame the Americans, you can blame Karzai's allies. Everybody knows that Karzai sided with a lot of notorious warlords who had a terrible history of human rights violations, but he was trying to retain his electoral capacity. So things got really messy politically, and so all of a sudden this alliance that had been trying to stabilize Afghanistan and turn it into a peaceful democratic country was sort of falling apart at the foundations.
Now, time moves on, Afghanistan deteriorates further and further. And how did you feel when America was negotiating with the Taliban, Zal Khalilzad was negotiating with the Taliban, and the outcome of that negotiation was the deal in Doha? When you got the text of that deal, how did you feel about that?
It's not a personal feeling so much. It's just, I guess my answer would be, as a journalist watching this unfold, you could tell it wasn't going to turn out well. And again, in public, there was all these reassurances, but behind the scenes, the reality was clear that things weren't going in the right direction. Things were falling apart. And really, you can trace this back to Obama's last year in office. In December of 2014 is really the landmark moment where the US and NATO announced the end of the combat mission in Afghanistan, right?
Yeah.
Obama's been trying to withdraw troops. NATO countries have been slowly drawing down. And Obama had promised that he would withdraw all US troops by the time he left the White House. That didn't happen, but they announced this end to the combat mission in December of 2014. So this is a full 7 years before the final pullout. But at that time in public, it was all, we've won the war. This is no longer a combat mission. This is a peacekeeping mission. We're trying to help stabilize the country. And yet you can tell on the surface, this isn't true, right? There's still Americans in combat. There's still NATO soldiers in combat. People are still dying, but there's this attempt to kind of whitewash what's going on, to minimize the news coverage, because Obama and his predecessors or his successors wanted the American people to think the war was all but over. But you could tell from that point forward, there really was no good plan to try and stabilize Afghanistan, to maintain the democracy there. It was really kick the can down the road, pretend that we have a strategy that's working. But at that point, I think it was going to be tough to turn around, but nobody wanted to level with the public about just how bad things were going. So you talk about the Doha moment and Khalilzad and his negotiations. No doubt there was a lot of distortion and lies about what was really going on. And you look back in retrospect and you think, of course, what a mess. But it wasn't like that happened out of the blue. That the moment had been leading up to that for several years, if that makes sense. And I don't know what they could have done at that point, but certainly things were a mess. But it had all been leading up to that moment for several years.
And in the book, you dedicate a chapter to Pakistan. Now, having followed Al Qaeda all that many years, and having not been able to convince Pakistan to truly side with the West against, the Taliban, I suppose, against the war on terror as a whole, but the Taliban as a group. Bin Laden was found in Abbottabad. How did you feel? And why didn't it change America's policy towards Pakistan? Even that didn't change America's approach.
Well, it didn't. I wasn't that surprised that I didn't know where he was, obviously, but I had spent as a foreign correspondent quite a bit of time in Pakistan from 2001 to 2010. And up to that point, most of the senior Al-Qaeda figures had been caught in Pakistan in major cities, right? And so it wasn't like they were all hiding in South Waziristan. They were hiding in cities. So it wasn't that surprising that bin Laden, the popular narrative was that he was hiding in a cave somewhere. Remember all the
yeah
you would hear Bush or Obama talking about oh, he's in a cave, he's in a cave. We don't, because the question would always come up, where's bin Laden? Well, that's easy to sort of spin that, but obviously he was living in a well-attended compound in Abbottabad, right? And a very different reality. So, I personally was not that surprised that he was in that kind of condition. It is kind of remarkable to think about that he'd escaped detection for as long as he had. And, it is sort of an open question about who in Pakistan knew about where he was or what he was doing. But this really just reinforced a pattern where senior Al-Qaeda leaders had sought refuge in Pakistan, as well as senior Taliban leaders, right? It
Yeah.
was all known that the Quetta Shura had been running the Taliban's operations in Afghanistan from Quetta. And the Americans knew this, the Pakistanis knew this. But what could the Americans do? One thing you have to remember on the war in Afghanistan, the NATO operations in Afghanistan were completely dependent on Pakistan's cooperation in terms of allowing US and NATO forces to use Pakistani airspace
Yeah.
to send all their airplanes to Afghanistan had to come through Pakistan. They couldn't go through Iran.
Yeah.
And they also, the land routes, the supply routes were all through Pakistan.
Yeah.
And so Pakistan knew that the Americans and NATO over a barrel, that all they had to do was close down the supply routes or the airspace, and you couldn't wage war in Afghanistan. So there was only so far that the US and NATO could pressure Pakistan to change things. And so the Pakistanis really had all the leverage here. The Americans knew it, NATO knew it. They would pressure the ISI and the Afghan and the Pakistani generals every year to change their approach toward the Taliban and toward Al Qaeda. But it was sort of fruitless because they needed their cooperation to conduct warfare in Afghanistan.
And were you surprised how quick the whole thing fell apart after, the Doha deal?
I'd like to say, I mean, it's hindsight's a lot easier, right? To say, oh yeah, I could see it coming. I was surprised at how quickly things fell apart, but I wasn't surprised that things were going in that direction. Certainly, Afghanistan has a history of when there are big changes that people know how to switch sides, right? There's been warfare going on for so long that people they put their finger in the wind, they can see which way things are blowing. You don't want to get caught on the losing side. You want to get with the winners. So there's a history of that in Afghanistan. And certainly there were plenty of indicators that the Afghan National Army and security forces were under real strain. There were a number of media reports, including the Washington Post, for months leading up to August 2021 of Afghan army units being essentially isolated in the provinces, having to resupply them with airdrops, and they were running out of ammunition, they were running out of food, and yet the Americans were spending all this money on the the Afghan army, yet the money clearly wasn't getting the frontline soldiers. It was ending up in the pockets of corrupt commanders. So you could see there was a real problem, even though on one hand, you had so many casualties among the Afghan security forces that were trying to put up a fight with the Taliban, but they were being mismanaged and misled from above. So you could tell this was not an army or a national security force that was going to be able to stand up to the Taliban over the long haul without American help. And so I can't say in retrospect I'm that surprised by how quickly the Taliban swept through the provinces, but at the time, I think nobody saw it happening that quickly.
And we talked about what 9/11 did to America. Now, what did those days in August did to America? And the last soldier leaving the way he did in the dark of night.
Well, it was a national tragedy in the United States, and I think to this day, most Americans are having trouble processing what happened because I think at that point it became clear. I mean, there was no debate. The United States had lost the war to the Taliban. And after 20 years of saying we're winning, we're making progress, we're doing the right thing, we have a strategy, it just was so vivid and incontrovertible that the United States had had lost. Not just, it wasn't a stalemate. It wasn't something that just didn't turn out well. It was a complete defeat. And the images that kept conjuring up history were what happened to the United States in Vietnam in 1975. In fact, President Biden had been asked this in, I think it was June of 2021. So this was a couple months before the Taliban retook power in Kabul. But things were obviously not going well, that the US was drawing its troops, the Taliban was taking over province by province. And Biden was asked, could there be another Saigon moment? Could the same thing happen in Kabul? And what the reference was to, in 1975, the US had to evacuate people off the rooftop of the US Embassy in Saigon by helicopter.
That iconic image.
Very iconic images of people clinging to helicopters, Vietnamese allies trying to get out of the country because they know they're going to be killed by Ho Chi Minh's forces, by the North Vietnamese, if they stay. And the United States is literally fleeing Saigon with people hanging on to helicopters. And anyway, Biden was asked about this in June of 2021. And he was very dismissive. No, we're not going to have another Vietnam moment. That'll never happen. That'll never happen. Well, of course, 2 months later, that's exactly what happened. People remember the images of the US Air Force C-17 aircraft taking off from the airport in Kabul with masses of desperate Afghans running alongside the airplane, trying to
people falling off planes.
Oh, it's just, it's so awful to, even to this day, to rethink what that happened and how that looked was just, it was just awful for everybody, right? To just think about that. So again, 2 months before that, Biden was dismissive that that could happen. So the United States government was completely unprepared for it, didn't know what to do, and it happened anyway. But that moment just drove home, I think, the American public was shocked because, again, for 20 years, they've been told that we were making progress, that we were winning the war. And even though in the last several months, it was obvious things weren't going well, that was such a shocking image to see that on television and to see the Taliban take over Kabul, the US military have to sort of fight its way out almost. There were suicide bombing attacks on Afghan civilians and on US troops trying to help. But it was a devastating end to 20 years of failure. And this was the war that was seen as the war of self-defense, the justifiable war. It was the longest war in American history, but in the end, it was a failure. The United States was defeated. And that's something I think you alluded to this earlier about how Afghanistan is, people don't pay as much attention to it, but I think in the United States, it's almost this collective trauma and people don't want to deal with it. They don't want to process it. They still don't want to, nobody wants to take accountability for what happened. There are so many people from both political parties who are involved, and yet there's this real reluctance to understand it and try and learn lessons from it. And I'm afraid that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future. Nobody wants to take responsibility, and it was so heartbreaking to watch that it's almost easier for people to just shift their attention elsewhere and try and move on.
There is this now. What there was this, one of the reasons, one of the mantras, or one of the rationale that was being sold to the public, I suppose, was the idea of the changed Taliban 2.0, which were being so emphasized in public. Now, having witnessed, having followed the way the Taliban have gone about their business, what is your measure of the Taliban?
Well, I want to be careful because I haven't been there in a few years, and so I don't have some brilliant perceptions, but certainly I think it's fair to say that the Taliban became much more savvy about their public image and public relations, and they knew that their old public image of being, against music and kite flying and terrible to women and girls was, they I don't think they were ever deviating from that. It's the same ideology, but in public they wanted to be seen as negotiating with the Americans and trying to be reasonable to some degree, and that they were going to carry on these negotiations and try and have some kind of national reconciliation. But it was clear they were going through the motions because they saw that time was on their side, that they were gaining in power and influence, and that the US was trying to get out of Afghanistan, that the government of Ashraf Ghani was weaker and weaker and more corrupt. And so they were biding their time till the Americans left. And that's what happened. So, of course, when they negotiate in Doha, they're going to say, tell the Americans what they want to hear, right? But they knew as soon as the Americans left, who was going to hold them to it. So I think they really were planning this out all the while. And if the Americans wanted to swallow their, the deal, that was on them. But you could.
And what did you make of Ayman al-Zawahiri being found in Kabul? And what does that tell you about the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda?
That's a really good question. I think that's one that has kind of gotten lost since then. And I wish I knew the answer to that, because I think at that point, Zawahiri was really, he was a marginalized figure, even though he was on paper the leader of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda as a terrorist network, has been a shadow of its former self for a long time. And so he was sort of this aging figure that had managed to stay outside of the grasp of the Americans. But I don't think he was running some sort of active operational network with a lot of power influence. I think the Taliban sort of tolerated him, and it was maybe an in-your-face thing to the Americans a little bit, right? You got to understand that the mentality of the Taliban, think about it, they've already, in their mythology, they defeated the Soviets, right? They defeated the Red Army. And now they can say in their mythology, they defeated the Americans, right? I mean, that's pretty, in their mind, they're invincible, right? That God is on their side. So, that this was their destiny. So it doesn't surprise me necessarily that they would let Zawahiri come into Kabul and give him refuge. But I don't think Zawahiri was, I think at that point, the idea that he could launch another 9/11 or something like that is probably wishful thinking on Al-Qaeda's part. But you're right. Why would they feel a need to really cut all connections with Al-Qaeda? They won the war. They drove the Americans out. Maybe they would tell the Americans, yes, we don't want to have anything to do with them, or we're putting them to the side, but there was really no incentive for them to do otherwise, I think.
You made multiple trips to Afghanistan as part of your job with American generals and officials. Now, if you could share snippets of stories, probably, things that you found interesting about Afghanistan, what made you know the country, I suppose, or as I say in this podcast, your laugh out loud moments from your trips to Afghanistan that you found.
So there's a real contrast when you're a reporter, a journalist going to Afghanistan with the U.S. military and separate from the U.S. military. And so I had gone on a few trips as a Washington Post correspondent. We had a bureau in Kabul. And so you're outside the military bubble, as it were. And then even then, it's mostly in Kabul. You get around a little bit, but you have a much different sense than when you go with the military or with the Secretary of Defense or with commanding general. You're in that military bubble. You're within their security zones, and you really have no contact with Afghan civilians unless they're ones who have been hired by the Americans to do things. So you're on these separate, well-guarded American bases, whether it's in Kabul or out in Helmand or Jalalabad or places like that. And you really there's so little contact with Afghan society and Afghan civilians. And when you see that happening year after year after year, and the Americans are still, the US military still, or particularly US civilians from the State Department or the aid agencies, are still guarded about moving around the country, you realize this isn't going well, right? If
Mm.
you don't have that basic security and you don't have that confidence that you can travel throughout the country, not only is the war not going well, but you really lose touch with what's going on.
And
And
did you come across, Afghan leaders, the people that you found interesting, or did you have any interactions with them, or
well,
did
I
you
did when,
witness their
well,
presence?
yeah, so when you're going outside the military bubble, it's much easier, right? And
Mm.
actually Afghanistan was a great place to work as a journalist when you're outside the military bubble, because it is very accessible to talk to people both in government, out of government, that it was actually a good place for reporters. One of the success stories in Afghanistan after 9/11, there was this real creation of independent media and television, and people understood the role of journalists, right?
Yeah.
It was that was a silver lining. So as an American, you could talk to uh, people in government, people who are Western educated Afghans, but you could talk to tribal leaders too, that
Yeah.
they understood what journalists were there to do, and you could get them to talk quite openly. Now, sometimes people are telling you different things, just like the Americans would, but you get out of that bubble. It was very informative. But the contrast, I'll give you an example. So I was on a trip with this Secretary of Defense. His name was Leon Panetta, used to be
Yes,
the CIA,
the
right?
the Italian, he's
Italian,
from
right?
Italian heritage, isn't it?
Italian American, right? And so he was actually the director of the CIA when Bin Laden was killed.
Yeah.
Then he went on to become head of the Pentagon. And I went on a trip to Afghanistan with him, and we were going to some forward operating base. I think it was in Helmand, and they were putting on a show for the defense secretary about training Afghan security forces, and they were showing that how they were training these Afghan security forces to uh, check for IEDs, for these roadside bombs, right? And that
Yeah.
how great this was, this unit that they were training to clear the roads of roadside bombs. And they had these poor Afghans, and what they were doing was they would give them, I'm not making this up, but they would give them these 20-foot long wooden poles, right?
Okay.
And so they'd have these 20-foot long wooden poles where they're just sort of like poking in the dirt to see if there were IEDs planted. And I was just like thinking, if this is where we are in 2012, more than 10 years into the war, first of all, I'm no military expert, but I can see that is not going to work, right? People are going to get blown up. If that's the highest tech advance you have, you're in real trouble, right? And
Mm.
they had these poor Afghans who were just like putting on this dog and pony show for the US Secretary of Defense on this well-guarded base. And you're just like, am I the only person who sees the emperor has no clothes here, right? But it became very easy inside that military bubble for the American military really to, I think a lot of them knew what they were saying was nonsense, but it also became easy to deceive themselves. They get this constant feedback where, you're telling everybody it's working, we're making progress, but it doesn't take a brilliant journalist to come in from the outside and say, this doesn't make any sense. I don't see how this is working. But so there was this real contrast as a journalist between going with the military and going without it. Now, at the same time, there's advantages to going with the military. You get to go places that you wouldn't otherwise be able to have access to. You do get interviews with US and NATO generals and field commanders, but also grunt soldiers and Marines, and you kind of get a sense of, does this match up with what I'm hearing elsewhere? And as time went on, it just became clear that there was a lot of puffery, a lot of
Mm.
spin, and that this wasn't, after 10, 15 years, things weren't going in the right direction. That was pretty obvious.
Now, what is your sense of the relationship between America and the Taliban?
Well, it's a how do I explain that? I mean, there's no diplomatic relations, and there won't be, or at least not anytime in the foreseeable future. At the same time, I mean, people in Afghanistan are suffering, right? I mean, it's awful. The uh, hunger and unemployment, and particularly how women and girls are being treated. And so, on one hand, the U.S. government has no diplomatic relationship with the Taliban, but I may have this wrong, but for a while, the US was still the biggest donor country to Afghanistan through international aid organizations or the UN. So what do? You know, if you're trying to help the Afghan people with donor aid, you're in essence, propping up the Taliban in power. And how do you get your arms around that? What kind of policy do you have? And I think that's something that obviously the Biden administration is still really struggling with, and it doesn't have a really coherent policy or know what to do. But that said, I don't think many countries do. You know, what do you do? You know, the facts on the ground are that the Taliban are in charge, right? And the idea of dislodging them militarily is not going to happen in the foreseeable future. But how do you interact with them? How you don't want to do anything to strengthen the Taliban, but you don't want to abandon the Afghan people who are the victims in all this. And I think that's something that, frankly, just like the American people, the Biden administration just wants to look the other way, isn't sure what to do. I think there's a feeling that there's some responsibility to not abandon Afghanistan, but realistically, it's very tough for them to come up with a coherent policy.
As is often said, America is the land of the rule of law and all that. And there is, you know, as an Afghanistan observer for many years, you know that the Haqqanis hold enormous sway and enormous power in the Taliban. Now, Sirajuddin Haqqani, the interior minister or the leader of the group within the Taliban, has, and also, you know, his cousins and others have, you know, $10 million bounty on their heads. You know, how does America, you know, squares that circle?
Well, that's a really timely question, Ro, because I'm working on some stories on similar themes, and we'll talk later another time about that. But
absolutely should do that.
So sometime coming. I mean, I don't have much insight to the Connies, how much money they have, but so this is one unanswered question, right? That of the United States spent more on aid in Afghanistan over 20 years than it did in Western Europe after World War II with the Marshall Plan, even adjusted for inflation. So there was an enormous amount of money that was spent in Afghanistan, and some of it went to help the Afghan people, but some of it went into people's pockets, a lot of it. And still to this day, trying to trace where it went and who got it is important. And so working on some journalism on that front.
Oh, that's great. I think one of the things that I've kind of really wondered about is, you know, all these men who fled Afghanistan in disgrace with millions of dollars in their pockets or their bank accounts, why aren't there people investigating them to where the money is, hold them accountable? And it's great to hear that you've picked up on that assignment.
I want to be careful because I'm still working on it, but I think it's a very important story to be done. Let's put it that way. And I totally agree with you.
Oh, I'm so grateful. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Craig.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Enjoyed it. And thank you for doing all you do to keep public attention on what's going on there, because that is what's important, that we can't lose sight of what happened or what is happening now. So thank you for that.